Imagine standing in the city of Nantes in the spring of 1598. The air still carries the ghost of gunpowder. For 40 years, France has been tearing itself apart, not over theology, but over power. Catholics and Protestants have been killing each other in the name of the same God. Villages lie in ruins. Families are shattered. And most people believe this war will never end. Then a king does something nobody thought possible. Henry IV raises his quill and signs his name. In that single act, he grants his enemies the right to exist. He chooses compromise over conquest. And in doing so, he changes the course of history. The Edict of Nantes was not a perfect document. It was not a declaration of universal brotherhood. But in April 1598, it became one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in European history, a fragile, imperfect, and ultimately temporary answer to a question that would haunt the Western world for centuries. Can a state survive when its people do not share the same faith? To understand why the Edict of Nantes mattered so profoundly, we must travel back to a France convulsed by religious hatred. The Protestant Reformation had swept through Europe like a wildfire in the early 16th century, and France was not spared. The Calvinist Protestants of France, known as Huguenots, had grown in numbers and in confidence, carving out communities across the country in a nation that was overwhelmingly and fiercely Catholic. The tension was not merely theological. It was political, economic, and deeply personal. The Edict of Saint-Germain, promulgated 36 years earlier by Catherine de Médicis, had attempted to grant limited tolerance to the Huguenots. But that fragile gesture was swallowed almost immediately by catastrophe. The edict was not formally registered until after the massacre of Vassy on the 1st of March, 1562, when Catholic forces slaughtered a congregation of Huguenots at prayer. That massacre lit the fuse. It triggered the first of the French Wars of Religion, a series of conflicts that would bleed France for the better part of 4 decades. Town turned against town. Neighbor turned against neighbor. And in 1572, on the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day, thousands of Huguenots were massacred across France in an eruption of violence, so savage it shocked even a Europe already accustomed to religious killing. By the time Henry IV came to power in 1589, France was exhausted. The country had been at war with itself for a generation. The king who now held the crown was himself a man of extraordinary complexity, a former Protestant who had converted to Catholicism in 1593, widely believed to have done so not out of genuine faith, but out of political necessity to secure his grip on the throne. He understood both communities from the inside. He had prayed in Protestant churches and now wore the Catholic crown. That dual experience gave him something rare among rulers of his age, a pragmatic empathy that transcended dogma. The edict Henry signed was a document of breathtaking legal detail. It contained 4 basic texts, including a main body of 92 articles, largely drawn from the failed peace treaties of the preceding wars. It also included 56 secret articles dealing specifically with Protestant rights and obligations. 2 letters patent, known as brevets, addressed military and pastoral arrangements. The Huguenots were granted safe havens, fortified strongholds called places de sûreté, including the powerful port city of La Rochelle. The French crown agreed to pay 180,000 écus a year to support these strongholds, alongside a further 150 emergency forts to be maintained at Huguenot expense. These were not symbolic gestures. They were the architecture of survival. The rights enshrined in the edict were specific and hard-won. Huguenots gained freedom of conscience and the right to practice their religion in specified towns and cities. They could hold public office, serving as judges and administrators without renouncing their faith. They could maintain their own schools and universities with government funding. They could travel freely across France without having their property seized. They could bury their dead in their own cemeteries. These were not abstract liberties. They were the daily dignities of human existence, and for decades they had been denied. Yet the edict was also a document of profound limitation. It upheld Catholicism as the established religion of France. Protestants were still required to pay the Catholic tithe, to observe Catholic holidays, and to submit to Catholic restrictions on marriage. Their freedom of worship was confined to specified geographic areas. The edict made no mention whatsoever of Jews or Muslims, whose existence in France was effectively invisible to the law. As the scholar George Rothrock observed, toleration in France was a royal notion. It depended entirely on the continued goodwill of the crown. The moment that goodwill evaporated, so did the protection. Henry IV understood that neither side was truly satisfied. Catholics rejected the edict's implicit recognition of Protestantism as a permanent feature of French society. They had not fought for decades to share their country with heretics. Protestants, for their part, had hoped for full equality with Catholics and received something considerably less. When Pope Clement VII heard the terms of the edict, he reportedly cried out, "This crucifies me." The king had managed the remarkable feat of angering nearly everyone, which, in the world of political compromise, is sometimes the truest measure of a fair deal. For ordinary Huguenots across France, the edict meant the difference between life and death, between hiding and existing openly. Families who had practiced their faith in secret, who had watched relatives dragged away or cut down in the street, could now worship without fear of immediate massacre. A Protestant merchant could do business without being barred from his trade. A Protestant lawyer could argue in court. A Protestant father could bury his child with dignity. These were not small things. They were everything. But history is rarely kind to fragile compromises. In 1629, King Louis XIII withdrew the military brevets following a final religious civil war, stripping the Huguenots of their fortified strongholds. The safe havens were gone. And in October 1685, Louis XIV, the grandson of Henry IV, the Sun King who brooked no division in his realm, signed the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoking the Edict of Nantes entirely. What followed was a catastrophe. Huguenots fled France in their hundreds of thousands, skilled artisans, merchants, intellectuals, soldiers, carrying their talents to England, the Dutch Republic, Prussia, and beyond. France bled away a generation of its most capable citizens. The Protestant nations bordering France grew more hostile. The revocation was not merely a religious act. It was an economic and diplomatic wound that France would carry for years. What makes the Edict of Nantes so philosophically remarkable is not what it achieved, but what it attempted. In an age governed by the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, the ruler's faith becomes the nation's faith, Henry IV proposed something genuinely radical. He separated civil unity from religious unity. He suggested, however tentatively, that a state could function, could even flourish, when its citizens did not all worship the same way. He opened, as historians have noted, a path toward secularism. The edict did not arrive at religious freedom in the modern sense, but it pointed in that direction, and in 1598, that was an extraordinary act of imagination. The story of the Edict of Nantes echoes loudly in the present day. Across the globe, nations continue to wrestle with the same fundamental question Henry IV faced on the banks of the Loire. How do you build a shared society out of people who hold irreconcilable beliefs? France itself has grappled with this question through its long tradition of laïcité, the strict separation of church and state, a tradition that traces one of its deepest roots back to that April morning in 1598. The tensions between religious identity and civic belonging that tore France apart in the 16th century have not disappeared. They have simply changed their form. The lesson of the Edict of Nantes is not that tolerance is easy or permanent or self-sustaining. The lesson is that tolerance requires active, deliberate, and ongoing commitment from those who hold power. Henry IV understood this. He built it into law, into military arrangements, into the very architecture of the state. His grandson forgot it or chose to ignore it, and the consequences were irreversible. Every generation faces its own version of this choice. The question is always the same. Do we build walls between those who are different from us, or do we build something harder, something more fragile, and infinitely more worth having, a society wide enough to hold us all? The Edict of Nantes, for 87 years, tried to answer yes. That it failed does not diminish the attempt. If anything, it makes the attempt more urgent to remember.